kind as to tell us about historical data.
Hey, I have to start with some explanation. So I'm a historian, and I'm mostly working in the field of history, mostly historical demography and economical history. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the intellectual history, about these very great studies, about one Renaissance humanist who got some religious ideas and so on and so on. I'm going to look for some information that would allow us, at least on to some degree, to analyze the more general things connected to the religionists, to look for some indicators that would describe the whole populations, maybe sometimes quite small populations, but still whole populations, not this one very interesting guy with very interesting point of view, although I'm also going to refer slightly to those studies. So my focus is going to be on the sources and what we could do with those sources, looking for some indicators of the religiosity. So I would start by talking maybe 2 or 3 minutes about the peculiarity of historical research, why it's different comparing to the other social sciences. Although even among historians there is discussion, are we humanists or are we social scientists? So it's pretty more complicated. Then I would look for some qualitative ways of counting things, so qualitative interpretation. I will show one of more recent data source that we could use for some kind of analysis. And then I'm also going to talk something about other ways of doing things, or moving more into this anthropology of religion, if you would like to use a more modern paradigm. So, why it's hard to be a historian? At least good historian. I start with historian, then I said, no, a lot of people are doing this in many different ways, so I imagine this good historian. So first of all, we got the problem with the sources, because we are not going to create our own sources. Apart from some very contemporary historians, we are not able to ask people what they're thinking about something. We have to base our research on the sources that were created not for us, but for some bureaucratic institutions 200 years ago, with completely other idea why they are doing that. So historians, comparing to other social sciences, got the problem that their research objects are already dead. And that's a problem. Because we cannot do a lot of things that other people will find quite easy to do. For example, ask, what do you mean when you do something like that? What is your reason to doing something? We could only observe those things in all documents or all sources that were created with completely other idea why they are doing that. What's more, even if you got sources, we have to always to remember that there is a problem of selection. If the contemporary sociologists got the problem that some people didn't answer to the question or something like that, historians got those problems times 20 or maybe even 100. A lot of sources that we know that they existed in the past haven't survived to our era. And that's a big problem, because quite often we don't know what was the reason that some things have survived and some things were destroyed. What is the random process which would allow us to treat those sources that survived as this, let's say, good sample of the past? Or maybe there were some special reasons why only this type of the sources have survived, why only this part of the archive stays with us. And here I'm imagining some reasons why the things could be destroyed. So wars are the most important reason, fires and other natural disasters, but also rodents. So sometimes you are discovering that there was a very interesting source, but mostly it was eaten by the mice or rats or something like that. And you got only two pages of something, and now deal with that. Sometimes lack of space. So for example, at some moment, some bureaucrats have decided, okay, so we don't need that documents because they are not important for us now. So they're destroying a lot of materials only because they decided that nobody is going to need them in the future. And sometimes, for example, we got soldiers that decided that they want to make some cigarettes, and then they're destroying the whole archive because of that. So a lot of things happens, and we don't have any control over that. So that's the other problem. And of course, we have always to remember and think about the context in which this source was created. What was the reason that they decided to do that? What was the procedure that allowed them to gather information? Were there, for example, if you got some parish priest that have to prepare the number of the people living in his parish, is he going to be graded by the bishop based on the fact how many parishes do you have? That's a problem that we also have to remember, and historians are spending a lot of time thinking about sources and doing something which is called source critique. So thinking, what do we know because of this source, and why this source looks like it looks, and so on and so on. So according to many, the modern history starts in the 19th century with the German historians who start to think about these medieval sources and the problems connected with the sources. We have to also to remember that even the basic concept that we are using, for example, religion, let's say, are quite fluid. So if we see that somebody in the 16th century is using some term, it doesn't mean that he's using the same term as we think that he is using. The things changes between cultures, between time periods, between social groups in the given society. It's very dangerous to assume that we know what they were thinking when they were using this word or thinking about this concept. So that's always a big problem. Multiplied by the fact that we don't have something which is called common knowledge with those people. Even now, if you got some research questions and we got some problems with the answers, we could use our common knowledge to evaluate, okay, so maybe they were thinking about that. Or maybe that's the reason why the answer sounds like it sounds. In the past, when we got people from other cultures, maybe it's our culture, but our culture 300 years ago, living, let's say, in very close rural population, we don't have a lot of common knowledge with them. We could try to discover what were the way of thinking or imagining world, but it's always only the reconstruction. So that's a very big problem for historians. And of course, you need some special competences to work on the old sources. For example, you have to know other languages, or you have to know your own language, but in form that it was used 300 years ago. You have to be able to read the documents that were written in different systems, and so on and so on. So that's a lot of problems, which also means that not a lot of people could do historical research, because it's not possible to find a lot of students that are going to go with you to the archive and they're going to go through 2,000 documents, and you could base your reasoning on the facts that they find, because you are not sure that they were competent enough to decipher some information that were written into those documents. So that's the old problems that every historian had. If you are going to the further into the past, the problems, of course, are growing and growing. If you're working on the contemporary history, it's much easier, of course. Okay, so I'm going to show you some documents, and I'm going to show you how we could use them to guess something about the past populations. So let's start with something simple, religious affiliation. Do we know to which church, to which religion people were belonging in the past? Usually we know, because they got this tendency to tell us about that. Konrad, could you start with the first paragraph?
Jakub Chrzanowski z Warszawy.
So, Jakub Chrzanowski from Warsaw.
Not sure what the next word is.
It's Rodem, so born in Warsaw. And then we got religion, Catholic faith. So in the first line, we got information that he is Roman Catholic. And then he's single. Yes, he don't have any family. And he don't have any money. He's without wealth. He's 18 years old. He got venereal disease, because it's the part of the list of the people living in the hospital for people with STDs in the late 18th century Warsaw. So we got this 18-year-old boy or guy who is from Warsaw, and we know that he's Roman Catholic, and he don't have any family, and we also know that it's not his first stint in this hospital, so he started these problems a little bit earlier. And we got, for example, the list of all those patients in this hospital, and in case of every one of them, at the beginning of the description of the patient, there's information that he's Roman Catholic. And some of them are Protestant, so it's the open opportunity disease. So you got also people from the other groups. But in a lot of sources, people are going to give the information about the religion because the religion is treated as the basic identification. So after the information, what's your name, the other important information is what is your church affiliation. So in this context, we got a lot of information which looks slightly like that. Other example, that's the list of the soldiers in one of the regiments of the Polish army. It's quite interesting because it's from the middle of the 18th century, and they got information about the height of those soldiers. So we know how high they were, but quite quickly there's also information about their religion. So every soldier in this regiment is described with the information, how old he is, what his name, of course, where he came from, and what is his religion. So in this context, we got a lot of sources. And of course, when we are moving into the censuses, and they start in Europe at least, in the 18th century, of course, it depends on the country, but in Scandinavia, even for the 18th century, we got some population censuses. And we also got some census-like materials, even from the 16th or 17th century. Quite often we got information about religion because for them it wasn't the question that shouldn't be asked. There wasn't any option you could answer about your religion or not. Everybody assumed that information about religion is a very important information. So up to the Second World War, in almost all censuses, you are going to have information about the religion. So for example, that's the Prussian kingdom in the 1870, and here you got information about 4 religious groups and their distribution into each county of the country. So we could observe, that's I represented here the percent of the population. So as you may see, we got some parts which are mostly Protestant, very dark, parts with a lot of Catholics, and also other groups. But I would like you to look at this last category, those missing people without information about their religious affiliation. As you may see, it's the extremely rare situation. In most of the places, everybody is described as belonging to one of these 5 categories in the censuses. If we got some places with somebody who is not Jewish, Protestant, Roman Catholic, other Christian or other religion, it means that it's only 1 or 2 persons. So we don't know if it's information that they are special, or maybe there was some mistake during the counting and so on and so on. So the authors of the census were assuming that everybody belongs to some religion. The place with the most number of those nuns is the Berlin, when for the population of over 800,000 people, only 400 people are not belonging to one of those 5 categories. So it's extremely rare. They were assuming that everybody belonged to some church. It was default situation up to the 20th century. And of course, this type of data, because we got a lot of them for a lot of time periods from a lot of parts of the Europe and other continents, allows for some, let's say, statistical analysis. For example, we want to discover what is connection between Protestantism and being illiterate and so on and so on. So historians are spending a lot of time using those data for those kind of analysis. This model suggests that there is some connection between being Protestant or not being a Protestant and being illiterate in Prussia. But of course, in reality, it's all connected with the problems with spatial autocorrelation, so we shouldn't look at that. But at the end, we got a lot of data which are describing religious affiliation up to the Second World War. A lot of populations were trying to do so. But of course, not in every case we got a lot of information for the whole countries, for the whole population of the country. That's the project that I was participating. We're trying to do something which we called the patriarchy index. So this is the index, how much patriarchy do you have in your society in the past. And as you may see, for some regions we got a lot of data points. So whole England, so whole Scotland, whole Scandinavia, we got almost 100% of the information, assuming, of course, that the population census were doing 100% of the population. But for other parts, which sometimes got only few villages or some data points, and we are then trying to describe the whole Russia or something like that. So there's, of course, the problem of the lacking sources and so on and so on, but we got those sources. And with some caveats, we could use them for analysis. So at the level of the information about the affiliation to the churches, we got a lot of data. But of course, they are connected also with a lot of problems. Okay, but let's start with some positive things. So we got this data. We got, for example, for a lot of parts of the Europe since the 17th or 18th century, we got a lot of information of this kind. We know how to work with them. So there is a lot of people that were thinking about research methodology, how to obtain the information from the census and so on and so on. And we could connect those data with other variables to do some quite interesting analysis. But at the same time, we have to remember that they were treating belonging to the church as something which is given. Everybody has to belong to the church. Nobody is asking you, do you believe in God? They are asking you, are you Catholic or are you Protestant? Or they're assuming that if you are living in this city, in this region, you have to be Protestant or something like that. So there is no place for your own answer. Everybody assuming that you have to be belonging to some religion. And of course, they are not assuming that there are so many atheists or nuns. They should belong to one of other group. Okay, attendance. Here you got a list from the modern, former Russian Empire, now it's modern Belarus. And here you got a list of people living in the household. So they start with the household head, then his wife, and his children, their children, and so on and so on. There's information about their age, but then there's information where they're participating in the Easter. Where did they go to the confession? And did they participate in the Easter Mass? And as you may see, this paper was printed. So the government in whole Russia is sending those these papers to every priest in every church to prepare a list which looks like that. So in theory, it would allow us to look for the people that are not participating, to look how big part of the population is not going to the Easter Mass, how big part of the population is not participating in the communion. So in theory, and we got this type of the list from many places. In the Roman Catholic Church, but also in Protestant Church, there are some sources which are called status animarum, so the list of souls, and they expect priests to do this every year, to prepare those lists of information. Who is living in your parish? And are they going to the Easter Mass? Are they participating in the rituals that are deemed as the most important rituals for each Christian? In the Russian Empire, there is expectation that everybody should go to the confession one time a year. And it's treated as the political declaration. Everybody should do that. If you are Christian, you have to do something like that. And if you are not going there, that suggests that you are part of the opposition and you are not like the government. You are not liking the government and so on. So in theory, we got a lot of information. We could observe the participation not as described by the declaration of one person, but as the observation of the priest that is going to control every member of his community and do the list of information. Did I see them in the church during the Easter Mass? Did they came to my church for the confession, and so on and so on. So in theory, we got a lot of information, which allows us to analyze something like that. And once again, a lot of population, a lot of periods we got data from a lot of populations of periods. And it's easy to compare between those populations. But at the same time, you have to remember that this creates a lot of problems in the analysis. First of all, are we observing the real need of people to go to those masses, or only the effectiveness of the political or social forces that make them to go there? We know for a lot of rural populations that the whole community was making people to go to the church. And people that were not participating in those activities were deemed as at least problematic, and quite often they were punished for not doing that. And usually this punishment was connected with being in the church and laying in the middle of the church for, let's say, 7 masses in 7 weeks, and so on, so on. So they have, the society was expecting people to participate in the mass. It was seen as this special type of connection with God when you are not, as the member of society, not taking part in the mass, you are creating the problem for the whole community, because now God could be irritated by the whole population that allowed you to do something like that. Especially if you are a member of important social groups, if you are this head of the household, everybody expects that you have to do something, because as the head of the household, you got this obligation toward God. So we don't know if we are observing real needs or just the social forces that make people to do some things. What's more, those observations, because for example now in a lot of Catholic church there are some similar lists. Each time, one time a year in the whole church, the number of people that are coming in the church is counted. And it's called as the statistic of dominicantes et communicantes, so people that came to the church and people that participated in Holy Communion. And church now also is gathering this information. But for example, in Poland, the rule is that you have to do that during the normal week, during the week that is not connected with any important holiday. And we know that Easter is one of the most important holidays. So the number of people that were participating in the Mass during the Easter, we are not completely sure how well it's connected to the normal participation during the other parts of the year. We know that, for example, in Russian Orthodoxy, there weren't very strong expectations that people are going to the church every week. But they had to go to church from some important holidays, of course. And those lists are mostly describing those special types of the situation. And of course, we don't know how good the priests, local priests, were in this record keeping. Maybe the people that were living in the fringes of the societies are not recorded on those lists. Maybe people that are belonging to transient groups or people that are very young are not registered there. So on one hand, we got a lot of information, but we are not sure what is described by these informations. Okay, behaviors. For example, here, you got information about seasonality of conceptions in some populations from the 18th century. And we know that it should be connected, at least in the case of Roman Catholics, with the Christian calendar. Because, for example, before the Easter, there is fasting period, and people shouldn't be sexually active during the period. So we should expect that there should be less conception during the mostly March part of April. It depends, this holiday is slightly moving between the years. We should expect the lower numbers there, because people should at least slightly limit their sexual activities. And as you may observe, in many cases we see something like that. And we could, using those data, because it's taken from the data about the number of baptismals in each year, in each month of each year, we could look for the information, is the population adhering to those religious rules or not? And of course, we could also expect that, for example, in the case of the Protestants, there should be no such correlation between mouth and conceptions. And we could also observe changes in the time. So maybe in the 17th century, there was very strong correlation, the strong implementation of the rule. And let's say in the 20th century, nobody remembers that there's even such rule. So we could use those data to look for something if we only got the information about the number of the baptisms in each week or each month of the year. We could also go for something more complicated. This is the method which is called familiar constitution. It was created by Frenchmen, but then it was used almost everywhere. So people are trying to reconstitute or reconstruct the information about the families. So we are starting with these church records that describing the fact that somebody got married with somebody else. Then we are looking into the baptismal records for the information when those people were born, because we got information that were baptized in this or other year. So now we got their age at the moment of the marriage. And then in those same records, we are, for example, looking for the information about their children. Is there going to be information that this couple got child which is born this year and baptized in this day? And then also we got information about the deaths, so we could also add information how many children has survived to the adulthood and so on and so on. So using this type of the data, and this data was, this technique was used for many places in Europe and also outside Europe, we could look for some informations that those people were not even aware that they exist. And for example, we got observed that in this 18th century Warsaw, almost 10% of children were born outside of the wedlock. So 10% of the children are born, but the mothers of the 10% of the children are not married women. So that's the information about some level of the social control, at least in the city. But what's more interesting, and that's the information that they also knew, because in each record there's information, is there a father, or there's no father, and so on and so on. But the information is something which is much more difficult to gather if you got only one type of the records. It's the information how many of the first children in the marriages were baptized at least, but there's quite close correlation between the term at this period, between the moment when you are baptized and the moment when you are born. Usually it should be 2 or 3 days max. So how many of those children came to this world too early? Because 15 or 12% later, percent of these children have to be conceived before the marriage. So we got this information, and it's again gives us some information about the social behavior which is quite closely connected to the religious attitudes of the society. And we also got information about the time interval between marriages, and it happens in almost all the populations that we know of. It's not natural, let's say. The spacing is longer than it should be, which suggests that they got some conceptions, ways of avoiding unwanted pregnancies, at least to some level. So this type of the data allow us to know something about sexual ethics or sexual behavior of these populations, and we know that at least most of the churches that we know of were quite interested in those problems. So we could observe the level of control, the level of activity of the power that church have over the population. And of course, the most important positive fact is that those indicators are quite obvious, non-obvious. So usually those people were not even knowing that we could obtain this type of the data. So the risk of manipulation, something like that, is quite low in this context. There's extensive literature how to deal with that, and there's a lot of books that give us some results, so we know how the Paris looks like, how the Geneva looks like, and so on and so on. So we don't have to do a lot of research to find those type of informations. And it's easy to compare because everybody is using the same method generally. But of course, there are a lot of problems. There's a problem of sources. If you are looking for the cities, a lot of people are not from those cities. They're coming to the cities, for example, because they get pregnant, and now they are moving into the city because they don't want to have their child in the village. So we're not completely sure, are we describing the situation in the city, or maybe we are describing the special situation in a much more bigger area when women with child are moving into the city because they got this illegitimate child. And it's of course labor intensive. You need a lot of time and a lot of workforce to gather this type of the information. And again, are we observing the individual religiosity, the fact that people want to behave that way because the church said to them that you have to do that, or maybe that's just the social control. Being against having children out of the wedlock is not only connected with being Christian. There are other reasons not to be doing something like that. Okay, so let's go to the recent past. Here you got two photographs from my hometown. That's the numbers of young priests that became priests in the given year. So in the first year, no, it's Bialystok. Okay. So in the first year, you got 15 young priests that became the priests because they finished the seminar and they joined the rank of the clergy. And recently, you got only 3 of them. Those with the hats are not young priests, or there are other persons. So there is this substantial drop in the number of the seminars in the city. And in Poland, there is a lot of discussion about that, how the number of clergy is changing and so on and so on. Could we use it as the indicator of something? I think yes, because it informs us that some part of the younger generation is willing to go to this very special occupation. Is willing to become priests and make some decision about their future life. Of course, it's not, we are not completely sure that it's only connected with the religion. There are other factors that could play the role in there. But still, it's something. It suggests that there's a level of religious activity that happens in the younger generation. And of course, since we got a lot of data of that, we could observe changes in Poland in the number of people in the seminars during last 50 years. And of course, in Poland, this statistics is discussed quite often because it's treated as some indicator, especially those data for our period, that the level of religiosity is going down and down. That the people are much less religious because the number of people going to the seminars is dropping year by year, and some of the seminars are closing because they lost this type of the students. But of course, the problem of these discussions. So first of all, we don't have data for each year because it's based on the reporting made by the Catholic Church, and then changing the system of reporting. So sometimes you got information that we are giving you the number of seminars, but without some seminars, and then you got a problem. So that's why we got some missing data. But if you are going to the archive, you are going to talk with Catholic Church, I think that we could gather a lot of more information about that. But the other problem is that the only information about the number of people in seminars is omitting the problem, how big is the population from which those people came. So if we are taking into account that mostly young men are going to become people in the seminars, going to be clerics and start their religious education, to become the member of the clergy, the story looks slightly different. The numbers that are now described as those very low numbers, that means that nobody wants to be a Roman Catholic, or at least Roman Catholic priests, are frankly quite similar to the numbers from the 70s. The number of young men have changed. We got this demographic transformation of the population, and that's got some influence on the number of people that could come to the seminars. In fact, much part of the Polish discussion is based on the fact that during the 80s, a lot of people were going to the seminars. But it's connected with the fact that the Pope at the time, John Paul II, came from Poland. And there was this tendency of a lot of people to move into this very fine occupation. And maybe what we now see as this very substantial drop is a drop, but not from the normal situation, but the drop from this very special period when the Pope was Polish, and that means that every Pole should be much more interested in, let's say, some religious activities. So we had always remember, and historians would help us with that, that the story didn't start years ago, that there are some past that should be also taken into account. So by using this data, but also taking into account the longer term when this data, this data could be gathered, and taking into account the demographic situation of the population, we could obtain some informations. And of course, that again creates some problems. On one hand, you got a lot of data. You could construct the long time series, and it's quite good. But on the other hand, you have to remember that you have data created by some bureaucrats for other bureaucrats. It's much easier for them, for example, to gather information about the budget of the seminar than information about the level of religiosity among the people living in the community. The questions that are interesting for them are not precisely the questions that would be interesting from our point of view. And of course, there's every type of the public statistics got a lot of problems with the reporting way of doing things, this tradition that we always ask about those things in that way, and there's this position that have to be filled, and other situations, because they are too new, are not going to be put in this questionnaire, and so on and so on. It happens all the time in this, every type of official statistics. Economists knows quite well, because this is always the problem with the official economic data, for example. Okay, so maybe we could move into this more qualitative approach. Look for some models or some information about the former types of the historical religiosity. I will start with the book that we, do you know this book? Cheese and Worms. Okay, so it's a very interesting book. It started in Italian, the author is Carlo Ginzburg. He found the story of one man. So I started with this declaration that I'm not going to talk about one person, and now I'm going to talk about one person. So this Menocchio was the miller in the 16th century northern Italy. And he got very interesting religious ideas. He was a very simple person. He was literate, so he could read something, and he read some books. But then, basing on these books, and living in a very small area, he created his own idea about the God, about religion, about the way that the world was created. According to him, it was not created by the God, but it just happens from the chaos. Like the cheese in the milk, the world have formed by itself. And those worms are the angels and God that just happens on the cheese, because they believe that worms or flies, they just born from nothing. Yeah? So according to him, the world was not created by the God. God happens after the world. And he got a lot of those crazy ideas. And then the Inquisition came. And he spent a lot of time in jail talking about with inquisitors, with the priests, about his ideas, because they were trying to discover how he get those ideas. And they are, of course, they were suggesting him that maybe somebody told this to you, maybe there was some preacher who informed you about something like that. And we think that this Menocchio just was this interesting guy who got very interesting ideas. And of course, at the end, they killed him because he was problematic. But still, this Ginzburg story shows us that normal people, not very important humanists, no people that read a lot of ancient literature and got these philosophical ideas, could create some interesting way of thinking about religion. And we also know that he was speaking about his ideas with a lot of people around him. Of course, during the trial, all of them said, we were talking to him, Menocchio, no, never, stop that, we are good Catholics, and so on and so on. But he was living in this community for many years. And he was treated as an important member of this community. So this story by Ginzburg, but also other stories that were gathered by historians, show us that this religiosity of the past was much more complicated than we usually think. It's not only the story of these very powerful churches that got this social control over the populations, and it's not also only the story of very brave, very intelligent person that create these new religious ideas and so on. There's a lot of this different types of religiosity that we sometimes could observe thanks to a lot of other sources. Court records, because those people sometimes are going to the court, and then we got some information about their ideas. There are Book of Miracles. In each place when there's some important thing that make people healthy or something like that, there are quite often books when people describing what happened, why they came to this place, and then they were saved by the Sant Antonio or something like that. There are some manuals created for the people that work, taking part in the whole process of religious activities, for example, in penance rituals and so on, and we got information about that. And in those manuals, there are a lot of information. You should ask people about this. If they say something like that, you should ask another question about something, and so on and so on. So it's quite similar to those scenarios for the interview in the qualitative sociological research. We got ego documents, letters, diaries, and so on and so on. People quite often are reading about religion, about their way of thinking about religion, about their way of thinking about some important parts of their life. Of course, a lot of people are also writing about religion in the religious books. This popular literature, so we got a lot of documents that could be used to decipher, to look for some information about religious activities, religious beliefs, and other things. And we could use that. But of course, that creates a lot of problems. Okay, so positive side, those are good stories. You could find very nice stories, very interesting stories about some activities. Sometimes they're really funny. For example, I told Konrad, during the Middle Ages, there are a lot of stories that somebody was moving next to some statue of some saint, but he or she did not kneel before the saint, so the saint came from the statue, and then he beaten this guy for not showing enough respect. So there are a lot of stories that saints are beating the people on the streets because they are not showing the respect for the holy statues. So that's interesting information which tell us something about the way that they were thinking about the relation between sacred and profane. But that requires a lot of source critique. We have to remember what those sources, why those sources were created, what they want to tell to the people at the moment, not to us, but the people at that time. We have to also remember that there are a lot of tropes and canons. There are a lot of ideas that not coming from the population, but that coming from the humanist literature, from the ancient philosophy, and so on and so on. For example, a lot of books that were trying to describe the ancient religion of some region are based on this idea that each religion is similar to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And it was quite obvious if you think about that. The Satan has created this false religion, so why should he create many religions? It's only one religion with different names. So a lot of people, when we're going to the other places, for example, to Scandinavia or Slavic lands and so on, they were still assuming that you are going to find the same gods, maybe with different names, but you are going to have this god similar to the Hera or Hercules or something like that, because everybody got the same. So we have always to remember that maybe when we are looking for the religious literature, we are looking for the very old tropes and not for the things that those people at the moment concern as the most important. Of course, we got a lot of individual stories, but it's hard to generalize those stories into something more coherent, to describe the whole population, the whole religious attitudes. Usually our data are connected to the elites or very special situation, and usually it's elites doing the special situation. That's the most common situation. And it's possible to find proof of almost everything. If you are very good in looking in the sources, you are going to find some atheists in the Middle Ages, you are going to find somebody who is very religious. Everything could be proved by the extensive enough query in the sources. So your work partly is connected with the problem how to decide which information in the sources describes some very special situation and which information describes some normal situation that happens in this society. Okay, so what does it mean for us? First of all, this whole concept of something natural, it's much more complicated when you are moving into different periods, into different regions, when you're discovering that not only different cultures, but also, let's say, European culture got a lot of different ideas about religiosity if you are taking into account the past. We have also to remember that even if you are talking about, let's say, Newton and his religiosity or Shakespeare, they are living on a different continent. They are living in a different period with different way of thinking about very basic concepts. We have also to remember that up to the 20th century, a lot of activities connected to the church was also activities created connected to the administration. The parish was the basic unit of the administration in a lot of places. So a lot of things that we are going to find in church sources were not created because of the religion, but because the tax office wants to use the parish as the way of gathering information, something like that. So it's very hard to distinguish what was religious activity, what was the activity that could be considered as connected to the religion, and what was only the activity connected with the fact that the priest was only educated person in the whole village. And that's why he had to do a lot of other things in the name of the king or somebody else. But on the other hand, we got a chance to run a lot of natural experiments. We got a lot of special situations, and if you know the history, if you know about reason why those data looks like they look alike, you could compare different social groups, you can compare different religious groups, you can compare observe a reaction on some historical impulses and so on and so on. And of course, you got very long time period of the observation. So you could look for something which French historian Fernand Braudel was calling this long time of observation, long changes that happens during the history that nobody is going to observe during his or her lifetime, but that's the most important things that happens for the society in the long run. So, thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much. Questions? I'm not surprised that David has some.
Thank you, that was excellent. I very much appreciated the list of potential sources for learning about the worldviews of people in times past, and also the sheer difficulty, not to say impossibility, for an ordinary non-historian to make sense of all that. I mean, to go back to some original sources would, as you said at the beginning, require all sorts of skills and abilities that most of us don't possess. So this is a very naive question, but are there works of historians that you would recommend for those of us who might simply want an overview of the supernatural worldviews of people from the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries in Europe, let's say? Yeah,
there are some would say that. Some of them were created not by historians, but some social scientists that are using the history as the research tool to describe the long-term process. But of course, there are, for example, there are very interesting books about the end of popular religion. So end of the witchcraft and the beginning of the this more standard way of the religion. If you want, I could prepare the list of the books that, in my opinion, are the most interesting. But usually, if the historians are moving into this area, those books are not, let's say, let's start with the Middle Ages and go to the 20th century. They're much shorter, and usually somebody is looking for 1 century or something like that. And usually they're connected with this declaration that this was a very important century, the century that changes everything. And then, of course, you see that a lot of people would taking another centuries to show that this was this crucial moment in the evolution of Christianity. Peter Burke is writing a lot about these changes between popular and elitary and so on. So I could prepare the list.
So in other words, historians could look at the long duration, but in fact they don't.
Yeah, that's always a problem. This Fernand Braudel, he wrote very important books, and everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people were trying to mimic his way of doing things. But at the end, if you are trying to use a lot of sources and so on, you are going to go back to this 1 century or 1 decade or something like that. That's always a problem. And historians also got this tendency to work alone, so that's also a problem.
Okay, questions? No? All right, well, okay. If nobody else has a question, this is a question I've asked you before, but we've talked about this, but I keep on coming back to this one, right? We tend to think that before secularization, nothing much happened in terms of changes in religiosity in, let's say, European societies, right? That before secularization, it was very regular attendance, almost universal belief in God and other supernatural entities, yada, 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 right?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the kind of indicators that David was talking about, right?
Yeah.
How much is that a naive view? And given the sources that we have available, how much information do we have to tell us that this is a naive or not necessarily such a naive view? How much justification do we have in that?
We got some proofs that it was much more complicated. And of course, historians love to say that it was more complicated. So for example, the French Revolution is a very good example of a situation when a lot of people are saying, okay, so get rid of religion. And then religion is coming back, and the same people that spent a lot of time destroying churches and so on are very happy that the churches are back. So that suggests that even during the one lifetime, people were able to change their point of view on the religion. Of course, there's always a problem of this very strong connection between religion and other things. So if the monarch is at the same time the church, the head of the church and the head of the state, you don't know which part of these political activities are connected with the political problems with the monarch and which part are connected with this changing religious view of those people. But we know that it happens. There are some studies about European Revolution, which are starting to use also these informations about the religions and so on and so on. But we know that there were changes. We know that, let's say, Reformation happens. And it's not only the activity of the Luther or Calvin or others. There's real need on the level of the society for something new. Of course, since Karl Marx, we know that it's also connected with some other social pressures and so on and so on. So maybe what we observed, see as the changes in the religious belief is connected with the economical needs of the population. And religion is just used as the ideology to explain some activities, but we know that there were changes. And we know also church spends a lot of time on writing these reports that there is a place when people are not religious enough and so on and so on. So that's also a very interesting source of the information. Church is still thinking about the problem that people got problem with religion. But sometimes it also means, I already told you that, for example, in Scandinavia, church spent a lot of time working with this basic education. So everybody in the 18th century is literate because the Protestant church is interested in the fact that people should read the Bible. But then they discovered that the 100% of the population, almost 100% of the population, is able to read the Bible, but nobody understands the Bible. So they succeed in teaching people how to read, but they forget to explain the words that they are in those books. So And we know that in the 19th century, a lot of Protestants are very interested in the Bible and they understand Bible. In the 18th century, they're able to read the Bible, but they understand nothing.
So that's really interesting and important, and I get the point that there was clearly a lot of religious change, I mean, the Reformation, not to speak of everything else. But I suppose what at least sociologists of religion are most interested in is, to some extent, the topic of this workshop, which is the supernatural worldviews and how that might have changed, and the extent to which people in the past, either well, it doesn't really matter exactly how far back one goes, but whether that was a golden age of faith where everybody was in some sense a supernaturalist, even if they weren't an Orthodox Christian believer. I mean, we know that there were all kinds of folk beliefs, superstitions, and so on. But was it indeed an enchanted world that people were living in where they were constantly thinking about spiritual forces, or in fact, were they just going about their day-to-day lives and every now and again would wonder about whether there was some witch operating or whether they ought to go to church or whatever. I'm not sure that I've expressed that well, yeah. But you see the basic idea. I guess the question is, how can we assess the religiosity of people in the past, not in terms of identification or attendance, because for all the reasons you say, practice was often socially or legally compelled, but actually in terms of their worldview or mindset. Thanks.
We know that it was very important, much more important than now. And we know that even in those strange situations, when, for example, people are not willing to swear in the name of God. So if you are in, let's say, in the court, you are asked, you could swear that you paid this person this money, and people are not willing to do that. Not because they did not give the money, but because they treating the Lord's name with utter respect. It's better to pay the money, better pay the fine, than to act against God or something like that. And it happens all the time. We know that for those people in the past, religion or things connected to the religion, so many types of the beliefs, was important, at least for some of them. But at the end, at the same time, a lot of them are quite anti-clerical. And they see this difference between God and priests in their parish. A lot of them got some supernatural beliefs, but also there are people next to them who say, no, this supernatural belief is rubbish. The other supernatural belief, okay, that makes sense, but this, you shouldn't believe in that. But even in the courts, sometimes people which should be described as very highly educated and belonging to the elites, for example, they believe in witches. So, for example, in one part of the Poland, there is the story about the young nobleman who starts to fall in love into one of his workers. And this worker was he. And he decided that must happen because of the witch. So he found the witch, he started to torture her, and then she do what she had to do. So she stopped this curse, and he goes without this sexual tension between him and the worker. And for him, it was quite normal to inform the court about that. And homosexuality was quite punishable, but because there was the witch, the problem solved. Yeah.
Other questions? All right, well, okay. Again, I have a couple of things to finish up with. Look, I mean, one thing that also always strikes me when it comes to history is, right, the example of Poland and the Czech Republic, yep. Right? Because what you often get is all kinds of explanations for why Poland and the Czech Republic are different, and then, you know, they'll say, well, Poland had the solidarity and the church supporting solidarity, and that's why Poland is a lot more religious right now, and so on and so forth. The issue being that when you get the kind of data that David works with, and you look at the oldest cohorts, right? We know it's a cohort-based process. You look at the oldest cohorts, the ones who were socialized around the period of the Second World War, the Czech cohorts of that time are already extremely secularized, whereas, of course, the Polish cohorts of the time, while they were already secularizing, they were very, very religious, right? So you've got the thing, the problem that if you want to understand the difference between Poland and the Czech Republic, their religiosity right now, you shouldn't be looking at what's been happening in the last 50 years. You have to look at least 100 years back.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, that's one thing that I want to draw out. I mean, this is absolutely no surprise to you, but
yeah.
that was one thing that I wanted to draw out. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, and this has been touched on in many ways, in your talk and I suppose in other talks, you're Miller, right? I mean, what you have there is, I suppose, a fairly extreme example of, well, maybe perhaps you could call it theological incorrectness, but definitely, you know, very different theological views. And I suppose my question is, how common do you think it was, historically speaking, that you had people whose views were theologically incorrect, that they were not fitting with what is the dogma of the local church? Right now, it seems to be very, very common, yeah. And one would think it would also be very, very common during those days. But what's your thinking on that?
I think that it was even more common because people didn't know what is the church opinion about a lot of things. So there are a lot of people that are going to some parish and then discovering that, for example, according to the people living in this parish, the Holy Trinity is composed of the Father, Son, and the Mother. Yeah,
and of course, makes sense.
The most important people in the Holy Trinity, and they've completely forgot about the Holy Ghost. They don't understand the Holy Ghost, but the Holy Mother, yeah, Mother, yeah, she is important. So for a lot of those people, they didn't even think that they could be heretics, because for them it was completely obvious, and everybody thinks something like that in this parish. The problem of also the Latin terms and this normal folk language that could be completely different. That creates a lot of problems in the communication. So I think that maybe 5% of the population got even chance to know what the church thinks about the most important things. And other know something. There was some process of the communication of those things, but at the end there was always problems there. And church was able to perceive that problem, but as long as you don't have very formal religious education, it's almost impossible to make people to believe in things that you want them to believe in 100%. So they are going to look for other things. They're going to connect things that shouldn't be connected. But for them, it was quite normal, and nobody was very surprised by this fact.
I mean, this is related to David's question earlier about whether or not there's some kind of religious golden age, right? I think sometimes when we think about secularism, we think, oh, you know, wasn't it great once upon a time when in the Middle Ages everyone was very devout? Well, you know, like they didn't understand the doctrine of the Trinity, yeah. Right? In medieval England, people used to regularly steal like Eucharistic hosts to bring home to put under their oven so that their bread would be beautiful or whatever, right? Like there's all kinds of nonsense going on that, and like I think, I don't know, like I think the harking back to some like fictive time when there was a religious golden age seems totally misguided for kind of reasons like of theological incorrectness and other sorts of things like that.
Sorry. So just to follow up on that, and I guess at the risk of getting repetitive, I think there are two issues. One is whether there was a religious golden age, and I agree with John, that seems completely implausible, but was there a golden age of faith in something, in supernaturalism, and that there it seems much more plausible that people were genuinely highly supernaturalist.
Yeah, but I got this the professor of the religious studies, who's very old man, who was who was raised in this small village without electricity and other things. And according to him, when he was a child and people living around him were living in the same conditions, it was normal to be religious because there is a night and there is a dark, and then is the moment when you see things, when you heard some things that shouldn't exist. So for him, the moment when the electricity came to the village was the moment when some supernatural occurrence happens more rarely. Before of that, living in this small village with this quite close connection to the forest and other things, you are going to have all those religious or para-religious experiences.
So in other words, this was the period before the Age of Enlightenment?
Yeah, in the case of the village, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Russell?